And welcome to Let 'em Talk. I'm Paul DeRIenzo.
And I'm Miss Joan Moossy.
And we're continuing the conversation, which is the program that started at 7 o'clock. And so we have Shannon Taylor here with us.
Co-hosting with us.
Yes. And Josh Wolinsky. Welcome, Josh, old friend. And our guest of honor, my father, Paul P. DeRIenzo, who's joined us. Senior, I guess. I'm Paul C. But Senior is joined us, and we're going to continue our conversation. And I hope folks are here at 7 and can see the continuation, because now we had the big reveal.
We're right in the middle of the story.
Yeah, right.
A really interesting story about a plant out in Washington State.
Right, and let me take a minute to just say, between you're basically looking at the generation, the sons and daughters, and a member of the generation that defeated the Nazis and won World War II, and part of our story today is about that, right? Because we discussed with Shannon. I had Shannon's dad on the show a while back, and we were discussing his role as in the French underground, fighting the Nazis, capturing the worst, the most barbarous Nazis, and bringing them to justice as freeing people from concentration camps, doing all these great things. Your dad, who was a 17-year-old kid, pulling the wounded out of the water in the South Pacific, fighting island-to-island battles.
I thought he was called the Fleet Marine.
Right. We were talking about that the other day. And my dad, who had to clean up the mess afterward, in the years after the war, which was just as important when we tell you about the big mess he had to clean up. So, and Josh, I don't know if you're too young for those days, but I'm sure your dad had some things to say about those days as well.
Oh, yes. Quite a bit.
I'm sure.
I think we're headed towards that direction again.
Oh, wonderful.
I don't think we're too far. There's a great song. I forget the name of the great singer, but we're on the eve of destruction was the name of the song. It's one of my favorites. And I don't think the circumstances have altered too much.
Mm-hmm. So, well, let's continue with
I think we should get back to the story.
Our story.
We left people sort of hanging.
I know. We just wanted to give somebody, new people who are just tuning in, a little bit of the background.
And give us a little background about the story, too.
Yes.
Just a sort of condensed version of what you've told already, so people are back up to speed.
Yes. Remind people of your qualifications to talk about this.
Well, okay. I was just I thought it might be of interest to the audience to hear a first-hand account of how we designed and constructed the first nuclear power plant, power generating plant in the country. It was at Hanford, where principal purpose there was the reactors were built to generate nuclear fuel, plutonium, and the likes of that was used in the bombs, and out of the wisdom of somebody in Washington or whomever, they decided maybe it'd be nice to demonstrate that these reactors could be used for useful purposes. So we developed what you call a cogeneration plant. We were given the opportunity to do this. Our firm, I mentioned the firm of Burns and Rowe, consulting engineers who've been in the power business in building coal-fired plants. And
you mentioned the founder of the company had worked with Thomas Edison.
Yes, uniquely. Isn't that...
so it's a direct connection.
Yeah.
It wasn't that far behind.
Well, yes. I don't know if that had anything to do with our being awarded the project at Hanford, but it certainly didn't hurt, because he obviously put together a firm with a lot of capability in that field. Well, all right, here's the challenge. All right, you take the hot water that would normally be spent to the river, the Columbia River, and
causing a great environmental distress in the river, right?
Well, of course, as one might expect.
So the idea is to get that heat out of the river.
Now, of course, the heat was the water was cooled in just coolers just for the sake of reducing its temperature before it was discharged. But the total amount of heat was the same, except it was at a lower temperature and less harmful. And when we took that energy, instead of simply reducing its temperature and then discharging it, and now using it to generate steam, in steam generators, which then would power turbine generators and create electricity. A lot of that energy, as much as I mentioned before on the other show, 800 megawatts, which is a sizable amount of energy for any power plant, no matter how it's built.
Didn't it power most of the state of Washington at one point?
Well, it provided a good deal of energy to the city of Seattle. I'm sure they used more than the 800 megawatts, but for many years they did, until they opted to shut down the plant. I suspect the major reason being they just had made enough plutonium to satisfy themselves, and that there was no purpose in simply using it, making plutonium just to generate electricity.
You might not know this, Dad, but on our radio show, we had many years, Joni and I, on WVAI, we had Glenn Seaborg's son, the man who discovered plutonium, invented it. I guess you can say invented it, right? It was a new element.
And he was a poet.
Yeah, the son was a poet, and so plutonium was the first man-made element. And
Paul.
Yes.
While you're on the subject of BAI, you just mentioned it. BAI is moving to the sub-basement, which used to be the sub-basement of Lewiston Stadium, where they worked on developing the nuclear bomb. Is there any chance, after all these years, for there to be radioactivity in that sub-basement?
I certainly hope so.
In other words, is WBAI going to become radioactive?
Radioactive?
I wish I could answer that question for you. It would be sheer speculation, and I'm really not familiar with exactly what was done.
That's interesting.
But it's an interesting point, though. Yeah. The point's well taken. I'm sure, though, that they would be able to detect any latent radiation and handle it one way or another. Wouldn't be the first time they emptied out a station, a source of radiation, and disposed of it and bottled it up, even though it's very...
I know there's a lot of dangers, like, for instance, how do you feel about the nuclear plant that's 35 miles away?
Well, I feel comfortable with it, but I do recognize that it does pose a potential risk. And I think the people who designed it and built it and decided to locate it there realize that all too well. I'm sure that the utility is well aware of the potential of that and is doing what they have to minimize that becoming an accident situation. And the longer it runs, I would think the less possibility is, the lower the possibility that it would become an accident. Most of the accidents that have taken place in the nuclear power industry have been on plants that have not been operated that long, and well, okay.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah.
Can it be closed?
Shut down? Oh, well, yeah. They would mothball it. They would
no, in such a way it was no risk at all.
Well, the only way there'd be no risk at all is to remove the fuel, and any remnants of any radioactivity in the form of waste or what have you that may be surrounding the plant, which would be in tanks surrounding the plant, not necessarily in the containment configuration that you would see, although there might be some, because obviously with nuclear radioactivity is like sun shining. It touches anything and it contaminates it, and then you wash it down and there's less contamination, but there's still some.
Like oil.
Hard to get rid of.
Yeah, figuratively speaking.
Or anything you get on your hand, and you touch anything that you touch with. So it's definitely something that has to be dealt with very, very carefully.
Oh yeah, to mothball any kind of a nuclear power plant. Even it's a small plant by comparison to those that are being built today, but still.
Well, that's interesting, but one of the interesting aspects of the story, would you like a glass of water? Or anything?
No, thank you.
Okay, good. All right. One of the interesting aspects of this story we were talking about earlier on was the effect that the secrecy had on it, and you were talking about how there was a wall, and Joni and I did a story they talked about a wall right between what you could do as far as wiretapping people in the United States and what you could do as far as wiretapping people outside the United States, and there was supposed to be a wall. That wall is gone, but there was a wall of secrecy between one side of the plant, which was involved in military operations during World War II, and the part of the plant that you were working on that was to use the waste heat produced that was being just dumped in the river because of the exigencies of war. And now the war was over, so they started to say, well, what are we going to do with this extra electricity, this heat, as you mentioned, heat, energy, right?
And it served as a starter for the growth of the nuclear power industry as we know it today. What I wanted to say in describing the plant is that because of the unique situation that you presented, that was presented to us, left hand not necessarily talking to the right hand or talking around the situation instead of being very specific, caused some misunderstandings that led to a problem, not nuclear related, because the problem occurred before the plant was put into operation, the steam generation plant was put into operation. But nevertheless, caused it to have to rebuild.
Right. Well, I remember we were discussing this earlier, and you took it to illustrate what had happened. You took an example of a pot of spaghetti that you had gone to clean the pot, and it was a stainless steel pot that was had a copper thing to it. What
you remember that?
Yes, that's a great story. Now,
let me. Yeah,
and this explains the problem that developed, right?
Well, basically, it boils down to this. They used, I can say this because, again, I was not privy to the secrecy aspects of this, but they used mothballs in their
what's that chemical? What's the name of the chemical that mothballs make?
Paradichlorobenzene. It's 50% by weight chlorine, and it's very, very aggressive to stainless steel. And we were using stainless steel in our steam generators to take their hot water and convert it to steam. And so even before the plant was commissioned to start during the testing cycle, it began to leak because I became aware of it under a very interesting set of circumstances. I don't know if you'd like to have been in my shoes. But we got a call after the incident had happened, apparently. We're ready to go to complete our testing and in a few months put the plant into operation after working on it for a good year and a half, 2 years. So we got out there, our executive, and they brought me and another engineer to the site. And without explaining why we were going, I anticipated we were going to see the plant in beginning of operation, that the testing would have been completed and ready to go. To my surprise, when we got there, I saw our steam generators lying askew on the soil outside the plant, and I said, "What's going on here?" Had not been told what had happened. And so...
how old were you?
Good question. I probably was no more than around 35 years old at the time.
I remember 35.
And
the weight of the world is on your shoulder, literally, at this moment.
I felt that way until the circumstances unveiled themselves. There we were, and I'm looking at our steam jail lying open, and I went through the opening to the tube sheet, and I could see this white powder on the joints, and I put my finger on it and I put it to my nose. It just smells like mothballs. Now I had been told that they used mothballs in their operation, but I was never told how. I had the faintest idea how the mothballs got used. And you would think in retrospect that knowing that we were using stainless steel, that they were made that pretty darn clear that it would be in the
now let's tell that story. You went to get the pot that had copper and stainless steel, and it had been filled with tomato sauce.
No, come. What happened? My mother-in-law had passed away, and she left a husband and 2 young children, 2 young boys. And my wife, Gisela, would every Sunday make a Sunday dinner for them. And it would be a hefty dinner, usually with macaroni and meatballs and something to take care of them for a few days anyhow. And she would use those famous pots of stainless steel with the copper bottoms. You haven't thought about why they put copper on the bottom of those pots? I'm going to give you some insight. So anyhow, I would go and pick up the pot from the apartment and bring it home. So, and of course, they wouldn't bother cleaning it. So I would bring it home, and on this occasion, it was encrusted with dried spaghetti sauce, which is a lot of salt, I can tell you.
Salt is sodium chloride.
Right.
Sodium and chlorine.
And it doesn't like austenitic stainless steel, the kind that's used in those pots. But completely unaware, I somehow got rid of all that stuff and cleaned it out, and it was pretty spick and span. It says, well, fill it with water. I'm waiting for you to boil the spaghetti. The sauce is ready. So I filled it halfway up with water, and there in my Sunday suit and tie, and I'm walking to the stove, which is only a few feet away, and the next thing I know, I'm wet, and I see the stream of like a colander. I thought I had a butt in my hand, and it was acting like a colander. And I turned to her with a smile on my face and said, "Intergranular corrosion." Jesus, stop it all! Get another pot. And I got an aluminum pot, and we.
Is that like a eureka moment? Now you knew what the problem was at Hanford nuclear plant.
And all wives act the same. I don't care. Get another pot.
Right. So just because something looks solid, it might not actually be solid.
And the answer to my question is why the copper on the bottom is that, if anything, if any salt attacks, it'll attack the bottom where residue would always be and dry up, and that's where the corrosion is enhanced. So the little copper piece is really like a little...
like a shield or something.
Precisely. Yeah. And above it, that's where the stainless is similarly attacked, but now there's nothing on the other side of it to prevent the leak from taking place. So anyhow, that was a. Thank you for bringing that up, because that really sets the. That's exactly what happened with the mothballs on our stainless steel. Now, you say,
in a nuclear power plant used to produce plutonium.
Who would knowingly do that? Well, if you know it, why would you do it? If you don't know it, there's nothing you can do about it. So, to make a long story short, we had to replace it. No, but the story that's really interesting is we get out there that day when we found out about it. I found out about it. The 2 guys with me knew about it. They purposely kept me unawares, and they were told to. In retrospect, I could only assume they were told to. We walk into this building on Hanford. There's all wooden structures there, because obviously if there's going to be destruction, they don't want to destroy concrete structures. They don't want to make it tough. They want them to wisp away with the wind and what have you. I can only assume that's the reason for the wooden structures. And this was their, one of them, and it was an enormous one, the meeting place where they would hold their and their dances. And it had a raised platform around the perimeter, and we walk into the room, and I can't believe my eyes. There's 200 people sitting around this raised platform where you would normally have your tables to have dinner and what have you, and the likes that. And now I'm beginning to gulp. I thought, what's going on here? I'm beginning to... And we're walking across paths, and I'm looking around, and I see people I recognize from the companies that worked on it. GE was the principal operator.
Edison.
No.
And
so, and I recognized some of the people. There were high-powered technical people there, metallurgists and what have you. And then I looked around, and there was the manufacturer of the steam generator. It was combustion engineers. You couldn't ask for a better manufacturer of steam generators in the country. And they have their staff and their metallurgists and all of that. And then I'm looking here, and here's the head of the operation, the entire operation at Hanford, sitting. I had met him once, and there he was, and I'm looking at some other well-dressed people there, and I can only assume they were there from the AEC in Washington. And I'm walking, the three of us are walking to our place, and I suddenly hear, from the gentleman who was running to me, he was the head of Hanford, no, we want Paul to sit here. And now I'm trembling.
Here being right on the dais in the middle?
No, right next to him.
Oh, in the witness chair?
Yeah, in a simple wooden chair. And so, okay, I kind of gulped and I sat down because I was the metallurgist on the project. Was
it one of Edison's chairs?
Electric.
No, it wasn't. A simple wooden chair. And he says to me, he says, Paul, we want you to answer one question. Would we have had the same problem, which now they assumed I understood just by seeing things for the first time and putting it all together, which I did, but I didn't betray that. Would we had if we had used the alloys that you had recommended, which brings up a different point. Because as you normally start a project of that nature and you're searching out what would be the best combination, materials, instruction, what have you, you do a lot of research on your own and you talk to a lot of people to get as much information as you can to support your judgment. And I had already formulated in my mind that I would probably want to use the most potent stainless alloy that and basically, stainless is no more than nickel and chromium with a little with iron as a base. But they were developing. The nickel company was developing newer alloys with greater amounts of chromium and more nickel to give it more resistance to corrosion, in particular stress corrosion, which happens when you have tubes that are under stress from the high pressure water and steam that is being generated. And so I had approached the nickel company for information because I couldn't recommend an alloy that I didn't know something more about, and I ran into a wall of secrecy. It was unbelievable. Usually they go out of their way to provide you with information so that you can use their materials.
5 minutes.
I'm not used to that out of the way providing information.
If I'm
no, go ahead.
Speed it up.
No, go ahead. We have 5 minutes.
Oh, and so anyhow, make a long story short then. Okay, all we want you to tell us, would we had the same problem if we'd used the alloys you recommended, which was something in between, because I wouldn't use the Inconel or recommended fuse without knowing more about it, how it welded, how it resisted the corrosion and the likes of that. And so I went with the stuff I was familiar with, which was a stainless steel that was supplemented with titanium and columbium to take the place of the chromium that was added later with the Inconel. Served the same purpose. And they said, we can't use that. I said, why not? Because it interferes with the operation of our reactor. In other words, the titanium and columbium are potential contaminants that would attenuate the reaction. I could only assume that was the case without knowing it. I was not privy to any of it. It had no secret clearance or anything like that. So, okay, so I recommended that we use the very low carbon stainless steel because carbon is one of the principal reasons why you get this kind of corrosion that I refer to in the pot. The chromium, when you heat it up to a certain temperature, will join up with the carbon that's present, and therefore reduce the amount that's available for corrosion resistance. And then you get what they call intergranular corrosion, in between the grains of the alloy, the stainless steel, and the likes of that, because the chromium surrounding the grain has gone to make chromium carbide, and there's not enough chromium now. You don't have the 18% that you need.
So something that looks solid is like a sieve, and water just comes right through it, even though it looks solid.
And
in
that's
other words,
exactly what happened.
Buy today.
Right.
That's exactly what happened at the tube joint.
So we have a couple of minutes, Dad. Explain this. You're on the witness chair, and they asked you this question, and how did you answer it in a way that you got to keep your career?
I said, before I answer your question, I'd like to explain how we got here. So I spent about a half hour going over the details and how we were constrained and what have you in our judgment and the likes of that. That was a factor, and then ended it without fingering any other person, any other company, and anything, any of the judgment that went into the situation.
Were you trained by a Jewish organization?
No, I was born in Brooklyn. I was born in Brooklyn, and I was not going to be intimidated. I didn't give a damn, literally. And I know my job was potentially at stake. But they realized themselves that that was only one of the factors. The real factors was they let the situation go by without informing us. And that's like going to a doctor and telling him you're sick and then not telling him where you have a pain or that you...
But the real symptoms are...
Right.
And so...
we got 1 minute, Dad.
Okay.
That is a great story. I think that's a good place to draw the story to the end. And we have to continue and have another, if there's more to this. But I think...
long story short, they took the chlorides out of the water that they served, they gave us, and we rebuilt
the whole thing from the beginning.
And we went for 7 years.
Welcome, thank you, Paul DeRIenzo, my dad, Sr., Joni, Josh, Shannon.
We haven't made any progress. Just think about 9/11 and the environmental consequences.
All right, and we'll look forward to see you all next week, and thanks for joining us on Let Them Talk. It's been a great half hour, great hour
today. Can I usurp your whole program?
Yeah.
You are the program.
Yep, you are the program.
Thank you.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.
We did it.